before we could even begin to dive into the extremely popular bully breeds, we need to cover the history of where these animals came from. The original Bulldog has a long history. Their English ancestry can be traced back to the 5th century, and they are thought by many to be related to the Eland, while others believe that a Mastiff type and the Pug were the original cross. This very strange mixture could explain some of the changes in the modern Bulldog's skull and face over time. A dictionary entry for the Eland likened it to the Mastiff in 1632, and a letter written by one Prestwick Eaton the same year contained the first recorded use of the word Bulldog. Eaton also references a Mastiff in the same letter, indicating that the two breeds were separate at the time. Many dogs, while involved in a variety of agricultural activities throughout history, were also used in various forms of competition. One blood sport in particular was known as bull baiting. Ancient cultures such as the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans took part of the sport for centuries, and almost every town in England had its own bull ring throughout the Middle Ages. A bull's neck would be chained to a post so he had little mobility. The dog was then released to bite the bull's muzzle and hang on until either the bull was dragged to the ground or the dog was killed. Bull baiting dogs knew how to play low or stay close to the ground, not allowing their heads to become targets of the bull's powerful kicks. Larger dogs were taught to approach the bull's stomach in order to strike successfully while avoiding the horns. The bull, on the other hand, was on the lookout for a chance to spear the dog with its horns and toss it into the air. The dogs who excelled in this blood sport were eventually referred to as bulldogs. They were notorious for their tenacity, refusing to let go of the bull once latched on. Dogs would sometimes suffer from broken bones or even death as a result of the sport. It is pretty impressive to imagine that a dog no bigger than 80 pounds could at times easily subdue a bull that weighed up to 2,000 pounds or more. While bulls were the main animals used in this sport, horses and even bears were baited on occasion as well. The crowd turned out in large numbers for these matches. The events were frequently held in a coliseum-style structure with seats surrounding the center ring. Early literature described the bulldog as having a round head, short nose, small ears, and a wide muscular frame and legs. England eventually introduced the Cruelty to Animals Act of 1802, which wasn't truly enforced until 1835. Since then, the bulldog has branched off into a few different directions. You would imagine that once bull baiting was banned in the UK, the original bulldog would no longer be needed, and they would likely be extinct by now if not for their exportation to other countries. The original working type English bulldogs were crossbred with the Bullenbeiser of Germany to produce what would eventually become the Boxer. They also continued to catch wild hogs and herd cattle in the United States, especially in the parts of the South where the terrain was too rugged for proper fencing. This led to the creation of the American Bulldog and the Old English Bulldog, as well as other breeds we will cover as we go further. The American Bulldog is said by many to be the closest representation of the original working Bulldog of England. The remaining non-working Bulldogs were bred to a smaller size in England, but it's unclear if this was done by selectively breeding smaller dogs or by crossbreeding with pugs, which most experts say was impossible at the time because artificial insemination was not yet practiced in dogs. Breeding dogs into specific, sometimes amusing-looking breeds became fashionable during Queen Victoria's reign, which lasted from 1837 to 1901. During this time period, the number of breeds for which one could win an award increased as competitions became more common and available. This example of an appearance-based genetic modification is still carried out by so-called breeders who lack a thorough understanding of how genetics work. Unfortunately, each new appearance is accompanied by unseen changes that go unnoticed until many generations later. When uneducated, quote, breeders manipulated the genetics of the bulldog to have different characteristics, they also unknowingly produced a dog with a long list of health issues which ultimately led to them living significantly shorter lives than their rugged working ancestors. The English Bulldogs of today experience heart problems, hip problems, respiratory problems, sleep apnea, and the list goes on and on. Modern English Bulldogs rarely live to be more than 6 human years old. According to a 2016 report published in Canine Genetics and Epidemiology, the English Bulldog has passed the point of no return. The authors argue that while the Bulldog's genetic diversity has been severely reduced, adding new, stable genes into the English Bulldog is now unlikely to change the breed's downward spiral. Most Bulldogs need human assistance during both the mating and birthing process. The cesarean section is used to deliver up to 95% of Bulldogs. Since they have been bred to have larger heads, over time these dogs were unable to give birth naturally through the pelvic canal. The Bulldog as we know it today would be extinct if it wasn't for human intervention.
Well, there are several problems associated with the Brachycephalic type skull, which is a broader head and shorter muzzle in phenotype. Phenotype is the trait that is expressed. We see this trait in a lot of Mastiff and Bulldog breeds. And while a lot of people believe that the Brachycephalic type skull represents strength, there's actually several performance issues that are associated with this phenotype. So let's look at these issues. There's basically like 5 issues. One, you have a dentistry problem because these shorter muzzles tend to have an underbite. Therefore, the teeth are not lining up properly like they should, which can prematurely wear the teeth and result in other issues. The second issue that you see is as a result of this underbite, the teeth are no longer able to properly perform their function. If you think of a pair of scissors, is what we refer to as a scissor bite. When you have a pair of scissors and the blades line up, they cut properly. But if you bend those scissors, or if that pivot point, that fulcrum of those scissors has some slack in it, your scissors, the blades don't cut because they're able to they're not shearing like they're supposed to and rub it coming against each other. See, proper scissors, the blades don't bump into each other, and they also don't have a gap. There's a nice shear of alignment, and that's what allows scissors to cut. And if you have a pair of pliers and there's slack in them, they also don't hold properly. If the ends of the pliers don't line up like they should, or if the gripping points of the pliers are not parallel on whatever you're grabbing, then they're not able to hold that item properly. You need the ends of your pliers to line up, the gripping point of your pliers to line up properly for you to be able to use a pair of pliers with a strong hold. And so poor dentistry or an underbite, you don't get the hold that you're supposed to get. And you need enough surface area contact with that object that you're holding. If you're just holding it with a short muzzle, then you don't have a lot of surface area to grip that item that you're holding. So that's another issue that you see. A third thing is a lot of people think that a shorter muzzle ends up with a higher bite force. And I guess they're thinking of the aspect of the molars and the teeth being closer to the fulcrum. But the truth of the matter is a shorter muzzle does not have a higher bite force. And the reason, because the dentistry and the jaw is all distorted. And not only that, but if you have a longer muzzle and you want a higher bite force, all you have to do is move the item that you're gripping closer to the molars. And when you move them to the molars, you're going to have that bite force. Remember, the different teeth have different purposes. That's why the different teeth are shaped differently. Your incisors are not intended to be of great crushing power. Your canines are not intended to be of high crushing power. These incisors and canines are for gripping and holding an item, while the molars are intended for crushing an item. So that's why the canines are cone-shaped for penetration. Okay, so yes, you do want enough bite force to properly hold that item, but for crushing power, you move the object to the molars. All right, teeth are designed for different purposes, and just when you shorten up that muzzle to get everything closer to the fulcrum, you lose so much surface area that you're not able to really hold that item and crush that item properly. What's the point of crushing skin? You have to be able to reach into the living tissue on the item that you're holding for that crushing power to do any good. You need to get into the living tissue, and that's why, wolves and other things, they have to be able to grip sufficient surface area to penetrate those vital organs when they're trying to subdue their prey. The next issue that we see in the Brachycephalic type skull is with a shorter skull, you have reduced the structural aspects of the skull, but you have not necessarily reduced the skin or the pharynx tissue. And as a result of not reducing the skin and the pharynx tissue, that tissue tends to be crushed up and wrinkled and folded in a shorter area. And when you wrinkle up the pharynx, breathing becomes more of an issue because the airflow is now having to fight and get resistance from those folds of pharynx tissue, which reduces the oxygen intake and the carbon dioxide dissipation. And then finally, you have a issue with cooling off. Remember, the dog's cooling system is like a radiator of evaporation off of the respiratory tissue with panting. The dogs do not have sweat glands, throughout their body. So this is how a dog cools off, is evaporative cooling from the panting aspects. This is their radiator, so to speak, to dissipate that heat. And when you reduce the surface area of the pharynx, the exposed pharynx. So yes, the skin folds you may still have pharynx tissue, but it's folded against itself. It's not exposed to the outside environment. And this is why you see tongues hanging out of these giant breeds, and they're overheating and they have to lay down to catch their breath and lay down to cool off. It's just an inferior design. And this is, phenotype. It's an inferior phenotype. And this is why we don't see it in nature. We see balance in nature. We don't want to give up one important aspect to gain another important aspect. We don't want to just rob Peter to pay Paul. The key in nature is balance. And if we look in nature, we see skulls that are designed to perform. We don't see extreme phenotypes that are distorted and mutated at the sacrifice of performance. Have a blessed day.